Good afternoon, evening, good morning, depending on where you are. And Fiorella, you're a little bit on the other side of the ocean to us right now. We're back for another episode of Critical Perspectives. We're going to try and cover a number of subjects. We're a little bit shorter on time than normal today, so we'll kind of try and cover as much as possible. If not, we'll catch up with each other next week to get to everything that we don't manage to talk about tonight. But I think I want to just kick it off, Fee, with talking to you about the Charlie Kirk assassination. I know that both of us have the same feeling that, you know, it's taking up way too much of people's attention. But in your opinion, the timing, of course, just as we arrive at 9/11, with everything that's going on in the world, people are claiming that he had turned against the Zionist movement, and that might be why he was killed. Others are saying it's going to kick off a kind of left-right civil war in the US. Others are saying it's going to bring in a raft of new surveillance measures. In your opinion, what's it all about, and where is it taking us, basically? How big of a deal is it? Let's put it that way.
You know, I don't think it's that big of a deal in the grand scope of things. I mean, we're dealing with so many more important things, but the thing that I wanted to talk about, and the reason I wanted to bring this up, Vanessa, is because of the attention that it's getting. In as you're right, when you look at the timing of 9/11 and when you look at the tension in the United States, you know, I have been going back and forth, and I think I will continue to be doing so in the next few months. And so what I've been seeing here is the situation in terms of how people are feeling about the stability of the economy. It's completely unstable. There's a lot of tension when it comes to the very loud people that make this about left, right. So for me, the most important thing is, why are things like this specifically being covered? Because in addition to Charlie Kirk, there was the stabbing of this Ukrainian immigrant that came to the United States. And the way that story was fixated upon by the media, specifically by a lot of people on the right. I have just seen juxtapositions of, oh, look what's happening now. We're being killed by the radical left, or we're being killed by whoever is, the crazies. And that's coming from the right. And when Charlie Kirk, who was assassinated by a shooter who was at a rooftop at an event in Utah, he is not a likable figure for a lot of people. It's not even just the left. I mean, he's obviously an ultra Zionist, and I'm sure you've seen several of his former tweets denying that there's a genocide in Gaza, talking about how Palestinians are the problem. He was extremely Zionist to the point where he had a relationship with Bibi Netanyahu. And where Netanyahu came out, asking for prayers, and then once again had an entire tweet dedicated to him and basically saying that he was killed because he was a friend to Israel. So for me, those are like huge red flags, because you had him, you had Obama, you had Donald Trump, you had both the neocons and the neoliberals coming out and denouncing this as, this should never happen, no matter how you disagree with people's politics. But the reality is, a lot of this happens all the time in the United States to non-celebrity people, right? To people that the media doesn't really focus on. And it happens because we live in a sick society in the United States, and we export that type of mentality everywhere else. And now I think what's happening is it's coming home to roost. And this is a conversation we've sort of touched on before. But the Charlie Kirk thing seems to me what I would call a psyop. Not that it's not real. Obviously, he was killed, but it is being weaponized and manipulated by people who want to start some sort of left-right, a civil type of conflict in the United States, or at the very least stoke the flames of what's already there. And a lot of people are falling for it. You had Candace Owens say, I can't believe this is happening. A lot of the people that, were extremely supportive of, say, calling out the Zionism, right? And even Charlie Kirk, towards the last few times he was live, he started kind of shifting his position a little bit. And so a lot of people have pointed to that. Is it like he was killed by perhaps Mossad, by perhaps some intelligence apparatus that was there that really wanted to incite something? And I believe that's very possible. I mean, we don't know. Right now, we just know that there is someone in custody who is 22 years old. His name is Tyler Robinson, and he has been accused of this crime by apparently he confessed to his own father. And supposedly, this is where I feel like this cannot be real. Like they found the words by fascist or something like that in the song Bella Ciao, which is a literal anthem of anti-fascism from World War II, right? And it seems to me there's an attempt to vilify this type and anything that's, anti-fascist now, because that means the radical left is capable of this, right? And so what Charlie Kirk was doing at the moment he was killed was he was speaking out against transgender rights, right? So you have all the elements and all of these things right there ready to go. And what I think people are getting just driven by emotion, both on the left and the right. And what I think is happening is this is precisely being used to incite a sort of war. But more than anything, and I think the most important thing is we're going to see actual more authoritarian crackdowns because of this, because we've already been seeing the Trump administration bringing in Palantir, bringing in Paragon, bringing in all of these ties, not just at the border, but now also all of that is going to come here. And so I think that's the most important thing here. And people are just falling right in line for it. And this is one of those things, just like with the Ukrainian girl that got stabbed and killed by a Black man. You're seeing that purposely be focused on in order to drive this sort of sentiment. And meanwhile, people are just being played like pawns on a chessboard, in my opinion.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, I would certainly agree with you that it seems to be, a tactic which is very probably orchestrated to bring in greater authoritarian control, and also greater pre-crime surveillance, and more draconian measures against perceived criminals. That's my opinion from the reactions that we've seen almost immediately after the killing, right? And I think this was expected. We're seeing a sweeping surveillance, sweeping draconian measures against all dissidents and anyone who confronts government policy, particularly in the UK. We're seeing the prescription of Palestine Action for their direct action to end the production of Elbit Systems, a Zionist subsidiary arms company in the UK. And, so I think this is definitely what we're seeing, not only in the US, but throughout the EU and the UK in response to what is happening globally, in the sense that what I call the Zionist bloc is expanding its aggression and its territory grab, its power grab, its redrawing of not only regional borders, but we're also seeing, an attempt to yet again destabilize Venezuela, to reintroduce the drug wars there. I mean, we'll come back onto that and get your opinion on that before we finish. But I guess I wanted to just quickly touch on again. I know that we've talked about it on a regular basis, but I feel the need to, in a sense, not keep talking about it to kind of, push it down people's throats. But I think while we are, and the entire world is condemning the Zionist bloc, the allies of Israel, for what they are doing to facilitate, enable, and basically sanction the genocide in Gaza, and now, of course, the ramping up of genocide in West Bank. The statements coming from Netanyahu's administration that basically, like Ben Gvir, they want to see the entire West Bank ethnically cleansed down to around 3%. So that's 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank alone. What we're seeing, of course, in Gaza is this attempt to drive everyone from the north to the south to an area which is a fraction of what is already a tiny sliver of land, the whole enclave of Gaza. So to drive 2 million Palestinians into an area that's a fraction of the previous territory, which was already an extermination camp. But I think I still, where I'm struggling with the issue of BRICS countries and their lack of drive to end the genocide and to actually, under the Geneva Convention, to effectively prevent genocide and punish those that are accused of committing genocide. And it is very clear now that Israel has been accused under international law of committing genocide. It's clear to the majority of the world population. And you have a nexus of countries which represent half the world's population, 40% of their fossil energy resources, 50% of world growth, 30% of global GDP, who are literally doing nothing. And their statement at the last BRICS summit that everyone was hailing as the new dawn and the alternative to the Western neocolonialist access that this region and all of the global South, not that I particularly like that term, but all of the oppressed peoples of the world have suffered under for decades, if not centuries. And yet we're not really seeing any alternative from the BRICS countries. We're seeing an increase in trade between China and India and Israel, both of them being heavily involved in the arms trade with Israel and certainly not throttling back. China's invested through Chinese state companies in the settlement programs in the occupied territories. It's investing in Ashdod and Haifa port, both of which receive weapons for the Zionist military on a regular basis. India is both an energy supplier, it's just inked a new deal with Israel in the last few days, but also a weapons mutual trade deals between them. Russia is providing energy. It's facilitating the delivery of oil from Kazakhstan because that oil hub is under their control. It's providing, its trade is not throttling back. It's increasing. We know that there are a huge number of Russian passport holders, dual nationalities, Israeli-Russian, that are fighting in the IOF against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Brazil is the only one that appears to be really trying to kind of throttle back. Lula is doing his best to reduce the supply, particularly of coal to Israel. Even South Africa, that has brought the genocide case at the ICJ. Of course, Russia and China also have refused or have not approved joining the case. Right. And what I find most interesting is in their statements this year, it was basically a repeat of the statement of 2024, where they don't even label it as a massacre or an ethnic cleansing or a genocide. And they're certainly not calling for any kind of sanctions or boycotting or diplomatic expulsion of ambassadors. Not a single gesture has been made by any of these countries, apart from, of course, South Africa and Iran, which, of course, is I'm not even including it in the discussion. Egypt, we know, is basically in bed with Israel since 1979 onwards, but increasingly so under President Sisi, actually participating in the persecution of Palestinians from many different perspectives. And what I find sort of disturbing is this inability by these countries to even address the fact that it is a genocide, and even to uphold the measures that must be taken that have been recommended by Francesca Albanese, by the ICJ. Look at Yemen's adherence to the Genocide Convention. And Putin, at the same time, while he's never used the word genocide in relation to what Israel is doing, he has used the word genocide in relation to what Ukraine has been doing to Russian nationals in the areas now reabsorbed into Russia by referendum, right? So I find it very difficult, and added to which Russia and China have condemned, for example, the Israeli attack on Qatar, on Doha, to assassinate Hamas officials. But neither country condemned the murder of almost the entire Yemeni government cabinet around 10 days ago. And there's a good reason for that, because both Russia and China uphold UN Resolution 2216, which was designed to be able to blockade 23 million Yemenis on behalf of the Saudi puppet regime. And we know that both Russia and China are also heavily invested with Saudi Arabia and with the UAE, both of which, one, were created to partner with the Zionist entity when the British created the so-called State of Israel. They also effectively created Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states that would later provide protection and collaboration for Israel, which we're now seeing. So I guess what I'm struggling with is nobody is holding them responsible for this situation, but we do have to hold them accountable while they are making very strong statements about international law. They're condemning the West for violating international law, and yet effectively they're turning a blind eye to what Israel is doing, which in my opinion is the greatest transgression of international law since the UN was created, and and has been since the creation of the State of Israel. And I'm struggling with people's inability to understand that the central cause right now is preventing global genocide, because it's also ongoing in Sudan, in other countries. But of course, Palestine is center of all of our humanity, compassion, and drive to end this kind of oppression of I'm not going to call them a defenseless people, but they are disproportionately unable to defend themselves against a US-backed Zionist aggression against them that's been ongoing for 100 years. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, morally, I'm not understanding why people are so clinging to a bias which blinds them to holding these countries to account and saying to them, you have the power to do something. We don't expect, the West is never going to do anything because we know they're absolutely joined at the hip with Israel. But these countries have an opportunity. They have literally, they have the only capability in the world today, apart from the armed resistance in the region, to actually do something economically, not militarily, economically, to stop what is happening in Palestine. And they're failing to do it. And I'm failing to understand, other than they're captured by the global capitalist system. And in their view, there's no way out of it except to be a part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with you my issue is also the fact that we can't even point it out. Like, we can't even say we think China and Russia have a responsibility to do something more. If it's not even just them, but we say them because they are among the most powerful rising powers that are supposed to be in opposition to Western hegemony, right? But if you're in opposition to Western hegemony, if you really are in opposition to it, that you would attack it economically not necessarily be intrinsically connected to it. And so we go back to, well, but they're trying to basically become self-sufficient. They're trying to drive their own economies up. They're trying to expand their economy and their interests. And how are you going to fault them for that? I'm not faulting them for that. But then then do not frame them as these idealistic societies that are on a pedestal that can do no wrong, that are the ideal, I guess the ideal status of a society that we should look to, because then they're not much different. Now, when we talk about what BRICS is, and I had a response to somebody that made a comment on your Substack when you were pointing this out about China and Russia's economic ties to Israel that are very well known. This isn't, we're not making this up. I mean, this is there for everyone to see. These are numbers. Exactly. These are facts. These aren't things that we're saying, I think China. No, it's like, it's there. I mean, China was the largest source of imports for Israel's largest source of imports. So we're not saying something that's not true. What we are saying, though, is if you're going to be trying to create this so-called multipolar world, and people are going to think that that means there's going to be more equity in the world, that there's going to be a fair game where, you know, people who have been completely just robbed by the West, we're talking about countries in Africa, countries in South America, in Central America, in Southeast Asia, in West Asia, that have consistently been at the losing end of the foreign policy, the unilateral Western dominant foreign policy that's dominated the world for decades. And you're saying, well, we're offering something different. We're offering BRICS. We're offering this, you know, cooperative, very fair type of system. Then you actually have to walk the walk and not just say what you think it is, when it actually isn't that. When we look at it coldly, when we look at multipolarity, this whole thing, and by the way, a new multipolar world order, that is not something I'm making up. That is how they describe it. That's how BRICS and the people in every single event that I've been with Russia or any of these events that we have seen in the last few years, they talk about a new multipolar world order. And that's what they say. So if you're talking about a new multipolar world order, then I want to know the difference for the people who are most vulnerable. I want to know if there is actually a tangible gain that they're getting that is not dominated by yet another superpower taking its place. And instead just of being one or two, now it's going to be, you know, four, let's say, right? And so for me, that doesn't mean equity. And then in that case, then it's just a rebranded different type of thing. And when you look at the reliance of Russia and China on the UN, which is an outdated, useless institution, then that's literally done nothing to stop the genocide. And when you look at what China, Russia, India, and all of these countries, except for the majority, I mean, as you mentioned, South Africa, perhaps Brazil, but even so, when the majority of countries that have the capability to stop the Holocaust of our time aren't doing it, then what world can I expect? What difference does it make if China and Russia rise and they're not doing something different than the US? Perhaps cosmetically, there is more of a transactional, I would say soft power type of, you know, relationship. It is more cooperative. There is some sort of win-win to some if you have, you know, if there's a respect, a mutual respect, if you have enough of something to show for it. When it comes to Russia and the way they operate pragmatically, that is how it is. I mean, they will have respect for Iran, but they don't necessarily have respect for the rest of the Middle East or West Asia. And I think we've talked about this before. They're not, for example, Syria. There's a level of like, you need to be able to play with the big guys. And so that mentality is still capitalist driven. It's not driven by any ideology that's actually against hegemony. If you're going to be against hegemony, that is an ideological perspective. I don't really think they're against the hegemony. I think they want to have a piece of the pie, and that's very well and fine. But what I don't like to see is the xenophiles and the Russophiles and all the people that are either, and you ask why they're doing this, they're either doing this because they're too invested in this rose-colored perspective of what it creating in their mind that China and Russia are something they're not, or two, they're profiting off of that financially. And one of the things that I know for a fact is, for example, the influence of Israel on Russia is there, because I couldn't even say the word genocide in any of my presentations at RT. Because Israel will get mad. And so for me, that's like a line that I think, I understand as a journalist, you want to show some sort of this both sides thing. And for me, after everything that's happened, you can show both sides and both sides will still say this is a genocide. There's no denying what is happening. And so for me, denying what is happening and not calling a spade is actually not doing justice to telling the truth. So for me, there's this like kind of like gripping desire for people to just sort of kind of justify things that they wouldn't justify the United States doing, that they wouldn't justify, anybody, the UK or any European country from doing, but they justify it or look the other way because there's also a sense of cognitive dissonance of seeing how just hopeless things are. And here we go again. I'm not trying to rob people of hope that there's a possibility of another world. But if there is a possibility of another world, we need to actually do it. Or otherwise, we're just going to repeat the same thing with just different players in different stages. And I feel like that's where we're going. I really am. I'm seeing less and less of a difference with how people are acting, because it just seems like another, yes, we're entering another cycle, but it's almost like a repeat of the same mistakes that we made before. And it just gets really frustrating because outside of us and a few other people that, we'll work with and stuff, people don't talk about this stuff. They don't even touch it. They yell at you for doing it. They say we're putting all of this on China and Russia, and that Russia's always expected to help people. It's not that they're always expected. It's the fact that if you're different than the United States, if you're not going to do what they're doing, then you need to act different. Otherwise, what are you, as you said, we know we're not going to get the U.S. to cut off Israel economically, unless there's a rapid change of government in the United States. You're not going to get that unless there's a complete overthrow. It will take years. Yeah. It would take years and years and years. But who could we possibly get right now in the near future to do that? The powerful people that say that they're against hegemony. Well, show me you're against hegemony. There's nothing more hegemonic than what the United States and Israel are doing to Palestinians, than the fact that now more than ever, they're trying to turn Gaza into a resort area for literal Israeli American elites. That's exactly what they're planning on doing. If you still continue engaging in economic relationships with an entity that does that, then to me that means that you're able to put that aside and morality goes out the window. And so then I'm like, well, what's the next thing that's going to happen? What else is the next thing you're just going to look over? Because then that means the ends justify the means, and you're going to continue operating as such. So I don't think there's anything wrong with us pointing that out. We're not saying that it's on them. It's on us to say, you need to do better. You need to be better, because we have hope in you. We don't have hope in the West. We have hope in you and the people of these countries that have suffered, that understand. That's what we have hope on.
Yeah. And I think, what it demonstrates is that people still have this need for some kind of savior complex. They still need to feel that someone is going to ride in and save them from the situation that they're currently in or they're currently witnessing. And, the thing is, when we talk about pragmatism and when we talk about realpolitik, that gets thrown at me also all the time, they're just practicing realpolitik. Well, I'm actually tired of seeing Palestinians and Syrians and Lebanese and Yemenis and Iraqis and Iranians sacrificed on the altar of realpolitik. The only country that is actually standing up within BRICS is Iran. And Ayatollah Khamenei said the other day, and it was a plea, it was a direct statement to BRICS countries, because he said, Islamic and non-Islamic countries, we have to quarantine the genocidal entity, and you have to stop supplying oil, you have to stop investment, you have to kick the ambassadors out of your country, end all diplomatic relationships with them. It was a really strong statement, but he's the only one making that kind of recommendation. And it's nothing to do with it being to Iran's benefit. It's literally for the benefit of Palestine. And that's the only country that is making that recommendation as strongly as that. And President Maduro in a previous, but Venezuela is kind of being kept out of the whole BRICS elite circle, for very good reason, right? Because they're about the only other independent country that is actually standing up and refusing to have economic trade with Israel. And, and then you have a situation when we're talking about realpolitik, you have an Al-Qaeda regime now in control in Syria. You have Russia vying to reoccupy territory. I say occupy because, are they going to do a legitimate deal with Al-Qaeda that they fought against for 10 years? The fact is they've normalized Al-Qaeda, but they won't normalize a constitutionally elected government in Yemen, right? So this is where I have real problems in appreciating that realpolitik can be used to justify this, because this is immoral, in my opinion. If you're going to normalize a government which is massacring its own people, literally committing genocide against ethnic minorities in Syria, opening the door for Israel to take Syrian sovereign territory and expand into Syrian sovereign territory, and then not only accept that, not only normalize with the Al-Qaeda regime, but also use collaboration with the Zionist entity that is violating international law from every possible perspective in Syria to ensure consolidation of Russia's position in Syria. This is no different to what the West does. And as we keep saying, if you're going to hold BRICS countries up, Russia and China up, as some kind of viable alternative to the paradigm we've been living in for decades and that the world is sick of, then how can we accept that they're doing virtually the same thing? Right? It's impossible for me. I can't do it. And when you're talking about creating an Israeli-American Saudi economic zone in Gaza, they're trying to do the same thing in southern Lebanon, by the way. I mean, a lot of people are probably not aware of this, but they're trying to encroach on Lebanese territory and establish another free zone there under the control of Washington, Tel Aviv, and Riyadh. And the problem is that when Russia and China are dealing with the UAE, for example, to the extent that they are, or Saudi Arabia, as I've said, that's nothing more than an extension of Western hegemony and Zionist hegemony.
Yeah.
So, at what point do the principles that Iran is electing to be upheld? But it's, when are they going to be accepted? When are they going to be seen as what the world actually needs, which is for international law to become viable again? Because otherwise we might as well just tear up the whole thing and we'll just live in a lawless society where realpolitik rules and humanity is just, flung in the dustbin, basically. And Syrians will just become, cheap labor for all the countries that are now basically carving it up into zones of influence. And that includes Russia. And potentially in the future, it includes China, because, all of these territories are also of interest to all the various economic corridors that are being constructed by all these countries, right? So, this is my point. And yes, to a degree, you could say, as you've mentioned, it's constructive imperialism rather than destructive imperialism. But when it's being furthered under a capitalist umbrella, then it's no different. Yeah, China is building infrastructure, but then, the thing is, when you're trying to actually research about what China is doing, right, you either get the extreme kind of socialist websites that kind of hold China on a pedestal, right? So the China can do no wrong. Or you get the nihilistic kind of anarchist camp that thinks all governments are bad and they're all in on the destruction of humanity. It's very hard to get that middle ground where people will actually have a civilized discussion about what is going on from the perspective of what is right for all of humanity, not just for the oligarchy or the ruling elite or the business class, the billionaire class. Because I don't see anything any different from Russia and China and the rest of the BRICS countries. In all honesty, I really don't. I mean, even Indonesia and Ethiopia are conducting arms trade and basic economic trade with Israel. None of them have stopped it. And these are not countries. Indonesia is, it's a Muslim country, right? And yet it's not, even Indonesia is not coming up with a statement of sanctions towards Israel. I'm just at a bit of a loss, really. And I don't know how we constructively get this message across for people to actually start campaigning for some kind of dialogue on this, because it's absolutely necessary. We don't have time.
Yeah.
I also have to put in the caveat that, of course, for me, I'm living here in the region. For me, the resistance is the number one defense, and it is the number one front line against Zionist expansionism and aggression and genocide across the region. It's not, it is at its peak in Palestine, of course. But the rest of the region, I mean, even Qatar now has seen that it's not going to be immune to Israeli aggression in the future.
And that's why it's so frustrating. It's because I think part of this discussion has to be about media and about, analysts and journalists that refuse to cover this to this depth. And it's there's a lot of monetary, financial incentive to not, right? That's a huge, I think, part of it that we can say. It's also the social media. It's not popular to have nuance in the discussions, because we talk about this all the time. As you said, you have the nihilists that say everything, all countries are bad, everything's the same. And then you have the people that just want to worship somebody. So when you come at like how we're coming at it, like in between, it's always when there's some sort of nuance and you want to actually really look at things in a real way. That's why it's so frustrating that they throw realpolitik out, because that is, we're actually some of the few people engaging in realpolitik. This is real. That is what is actually happening. What a lot of these people are engaging in is completely actually a fantasy. It is not real at all. It is actually just a very formulaic type of cheerleading for a team. It's just more iterations of that, from the microscopic left-right paradigm to multipolar and unipolar thing. It's become just very much iterations of the same type of mentality where you're just choosing a team and you're just repeating what is most advantageous for you, what is most popular, what X, Y analysts said, and whatever they say goes. And so when you question outside of that, you break people's brains. Is essentially what you do. You break brains. It's called the show Breaking Brains or something like that.
Yeah, we should have done.
Because it's part of it. Like, this is a segment in Breaking Brains. Okay, so it's just because it's become so almost predictable the way, for example, even with the Charlie Kirk thing, something happens and people just flock to talk about the latest thing. They just flock, and they all are saying the same thing or talking about the same thing. And a lot of that are distractions from really looking at what's actually happening behind the scenes. And so it becomes very tedious. But I think one of the things that people should be doing, especially people with a platform, is demanding that there is an actual cease in relationships from these very powerful states, whether it's China, Russia, India, whatever. That has to become more popular, because otherwise we're not going to be real. We're not fulfilling what we should be doing, because if we're not going to expect that from the United States, and we're saying we're going to enter a new world where things will be better, well, nothing is going to be better if we're still engaging in that sort of mentality, that low level type of evolution of heart and mind, or however you want to say it, of humanity. And again, I constantly say this: we have lost our humanity. I mean, after everything that's happened, how can I even believe in humanity? How do you people just pretend that what's happening isn't happening? And then that's why, in a way, I was also enraged at the level of attention being paid by Americans and all of these people that were saying they were anti-Zionist, that, all of this. And the moment this incident happens with Charlie Kirk, they completely forget about everything. And that's how people aren't really in it for the right reasons, and how motivations matter. There's a lot of people out there that say they don't care about people's motivations as long as they, cheer for your side. A lot of the Palestinian activism, for example, that we've seen online, and there's been the argument of, this person isn't genuine. They're just grifting. It doesn't matter as long as they get our cause out. No, it fucking matters. It really does matter. I'm sorry. Because then at the end of the day, you're going to eventually, those people aren't going to stick around. Right. And so what you have to do is essentially push the change in behavior. And I think talking about this and talking with our friends that are actually, on our wavelength and saying this, I think that's already having an effect, because now I'm seeing a few people kind of, come in and talk about China and, China changed their relationship with Israel, but very, very just tepidly. Right. But at least there's a push on that, because otherwise we're just, this world that people want to change so much isn't going to change. I genuinely think people don't want to do the work it takes to actually change things. They just want somebody else to come and do it for them. And that's especially a very Western driven mentality with a lot of the commentators and analysts that come from this world, where they just expect to come in, say their thing, and, and expect the world to change according to what they say. But there's a lot that is happening. There are a lot of people that are suffering because we're not really being honest with ourselves. And that honesty requires us being tough with, people we thought were on our side. I think a lot of people initially, when they talked about BRICS, thought maybe Russia, China would, do more, would be different, would actually, were optimistic about it, myself included. I was optimistic that this would be different. But then after living there and experiencing things and being and understanding like the real politic of what's actually going on and the pragmatic approaches, then you see, okay, well, this isn't exactly that. And that's another lesson to learn. It's not just, oh, everything is bad in the US and everything is good on this other side. It's like understanding that they have their things too that they should be doing, they could be doing. And yeah, I always say this, and I know you do too, like, you know, we're coming from the West. I'm an American. I'm not going to tell China and Russia how they need to conduct their affairs, but I sure as hell I'm going to point out that when it comes to actually saying you're going to bring in a new paradigm, then actually bring in a new paradigm, or just don't say that. And you know, and the people doing the, I don't want to say propaganda, but the cheerleading, I would say, for it, for that mentality, then yes, I'm going to say something against that too, because it's just not real. You know, you're lying to your audience, you're lying to people. It's just not a genuine thing. So yeah, I mean, we're going to continue pointing this out. These are facts. These are things Vanessa has pointed out in her articles. I mean, these are, you know, things that need to be talked about.
Yeah, they are. And, you know, ultimately, what's the priority? To end Zionist aggression, expansionism, genocide.
It's just one issue.
And at the end of the day, yeah, okay. Yeah, we got that all through the pre-Trump. Yeah, it's only one issue. And here we are. It's affecting the whole world, just as we said it would, you know, because it goes beyond Israel. It goes into the Zionist movement that is effectively a contagion that is spreading across the world. And this is another aspect of it. You know, if the non-aligned axis, the BRICS axis, is not careful, then the contagion is going to be there within their centers also, right? You know, they're all worried and understandably sorry about Western soft power, smart power, infiltration, and so on, and they've protected themselves against that. But I'm not sure of any protection in place against Zionist infiltration in their societies. And this is, you know, this is a major issue. When we look at what's happening in the UK and the US and EU countries, it's clear. It's very difficult to actually see any boundaries between, for example, the British government and the Zionist state in Britain. And we're seeing this with the persecution of medical staff and doctors by the General Medical Council at the behest of the Zionist state and the Zionist movement and the pro-Zionist doctors and medical staff that are effectively persecuting British Palestinian or even British medical staff that stand against genocide. So those lines are very blurred now. I mean, I've been saying this for a long time, that Britain is effectively under the control of a Zionist shadow state. And America is very much in the same situation. And my fear is that if this contagion spreads, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia are what's the word? That they're conduits of that contagion. You know what I mean? That's my fear, that we end up with a world that is just basically controlled by this entire movement. And it has control of every country in the world today. And I'm not being over dramatic about this.
Bipartisan support in military matters to Israel in previous years and today as well. But do you have cell phones? You have cell phones here? No? You're holding a piece of Israel right there. You know that? I mean, a lot of the cell phones, the medicines, the food, you eat cherry tomatoes. You know where that was made?
Because 10 years ago, if we were going to say, look, if you're not careful, the Zionist movement is going to be running every sector of your society. It's going to have positions of power within government. It's going to influence government beyond any kind of norm. You know, you're no longer going to be fighting for America. You're going to be fighting for Israel. You're no longer going to be fighting for Britain. You're going to be fighting for Israel. That's the point at which we are right now. Like where Keir Starmer is welcoming the president of a genocidal entity against the wishes of the people. Nobody in Britain wants Isaac Herzog in Britain. But this is my point. And Albert Systems now is being given a contract to train 60,000 soldiers a year. So the Zionist entity is literally embedded within British military, right? So it's a warning also that if there isn't some kind of, as Ayatollah Khamenei said, some kind of quarantine of this entity, it's actually very interesting that he used that terminology, because it's exactly how I see it. If you don't quarantine yourself, the contagion is going to enter your society, and it will expand and it will infiltrate and it will spread. And before you know it, because of your trade and economic partnerships with the entity, it's going to be very difficult to expel it. Because as we've just said, it will take years, decades, generations to get rid of it in the United States. And only if people are totally united behind the actual elimination of that influence in society. And we're way off that point.
Yeah, I mean, but I think this is a conversation that we've touched upon, right? About how, like, it's not even about Israel anymore as just the state of Israel. It's about the Zionism and that ideology, which is, I think people are underestimating how fascistic that ideology is. I think it's becoming clear to quite a lot of people, but the level of expansion, you have a lot of people that consider themselves anti-fascist, but because of the ties of Zionism to Judaism and the religious aspect of it all, they consider being anti-fascist as being, an exception when it comes to almost what Israel does, or what walking on eggshells around what Jewish people do in the United States. And so that is what's allowed the Zionist entity to grow and to continue to influence multiple states throughout the world. And so I think that it is a very valid point to point out that this is becoming a problem that is a global thing. And it's even, as I said, beyond Israel, it's that mentality it's that supremacist mentality ultimately. And it is affecting countries that are even, for example, in opposition, right? Because supposedly the United States and Russia are not friendly countries. They're not allies. They're at a war right now. And even though there's clearly a desire for them to come together at some point economically, out of the Soviet Union, there's that oppositional type of energy. But even so, both are working with Israel. So that is very powerful. Yeah. The fact that Israel has that ability to maintain two countries that are supposedly be at odds and have a relationship with both of them, and not just both of them, but with also China and with also Saudi Arabia and with also every single powerful nation out there. And people just are thinking, well, Netanyahu, we can remove him. No, this goes beyond that. This
doesn't make a difference. Yeah.
Indoctrination. This goes to something much bigger than that. And of course, you're going to be called conspiracy, you're going to be called an anti-Semite, you're going to be called all these things, but that's a reality that's happening all over the world, and a lot of people are seeing it, and they're quietly saying things like, especially at least here in the United States, they definitely are, and I've seen it in Russia as well. I've seen a certain type of apprehension as to why Israel is so powerful, and why, and this is coming from a people perspective, not necessarily from the government perspective. And so, of course, people see it because they're the ones that are, for example, dealing with economic hardships or dealing with all these things. And then they see, what is it about Israel? What is it about why we have to bend over backwards every time? And so it becomes this thing, this issue it's like the black elephant. The elephant in the room. We everybody knows it's there. People do talk about it, but it's not discussed outright. So yeah, I think that's a a valid point to make in terms of the larger context of things.
I know we haven't got too much time tonight. Did you want to cover anything else tonight, particularly?
No, you know what? I want to ask your opinion on the U.S. attack on the Venezuela vessel, because I think for me, the U.S. is trying to stoke regime change with Venezuela. They have for a long time. We know this since the time of Hugo Chavez. And that this is just another layer of what the United States is doing. It's another layer of what the Trump administration was always going to do. I believe we said it on this program, and even before we called it what we call it now, we talked about how the Trump administration was going to focus on Iran, West Asia, and Latin America, and he has been, of course, because they see these countries as their backyard. They see these countries as belonging to them, as called the Global South. And so I think what they're trying to do in Venezuela is to show this bravado of, we can attack Venezuela, we can do whatever we want. But I think when it comes down to the U.S. foreign policy, they aren't going to do it as blatantly. When they do things, they're going to try to hide it in one way or another. I think what's happening right now is a lot of barking from the Trump administration, but I think when they actually do something against Venezuela, they're going to try to do it in a way that's not as expected. And so I don't know. I don't necessarily think it's going to be like, for example, as some people are saying, the United States going to Venezuela with boots on the ground and, killing everybody and capturing Maduro. I think it's going to be more attempts at breaking it from the inside, because that's just our modus operandi. That's just how we operate in Washington. So that's my opinion on that. I think Venezuela, unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, has been kept out of BRICS. And they were not approved, and there was not enough fanfare about that. People should have. That's another red flag, by the way, that people should have pointed out. Well, they're supposedly allies with pretty much everybody at BRICS, but somehow, and it wasn't just Brazil, because if somebody else had really push back.
No, it's not. I think Brazil was scapegoated to some extent in that, because I think if Russia and China and Brazil and India had made the decision, I don't think there would have been any question over it. And a big deal was made about Maduro's speech and so on. But the fact is, they have been, relegated to non-BRICS.
They've been sidelined. Yeah, and there's a reason for
and
that,
that's despite their strong historical alliance with Russia and with China, right? That I found kind of shocking, to be honest. It was a bit like when pressure was put on the Assad government to basically ask the Ansarullah ambassador to leave the embassy, and that pressure came from Saudi Arabia and to a degree from Russia, right? Because the carrot of humanitarian relief was dangled, which never materialized, by the way. And Ansarullah actually came to an agreement. They honored the agreement, but still, it was kind of a blow for many people that sort of saw what was going on at the time. And I think what happened to Venezuela and BRICS was a very similar situation. I agree with you. I mean, there's been quite a lot on social media about, the fallacy of the whole drugs war situation. We've seen it throughout history with the US, when in fact the CIA is funding and aiding all of the drug cartels and weaponizing them and profiting from them. So I think, the problem is they're kind of running out of scripts, particularly with Venezuela, because we've had the Juan Guaido situation. People are not going to fall for that one again. Maduro now is pretty much at the height of his popularity. I think you would struggle to find a leader in the world today that has the kind of grassroots popularity that he has. So many attempts have been made already to infiltrate and weaken from within. I'm not saying that it isn't still a viable option for the United States, but it's going to be difficult, in my opinion. Maduro has already mobilized the forces to different areas of Venezuela. That's been confirmed. So they're prepared militarily. I agree with you. I think just as between, Iran and Israel, it's highly unlikely that either the US or Israel are going to try and invade Iran directly. But with Venezuela, I'm not quite sure how they're going to come at it, to be in all honesty, unless they create some kind of false flag. That's the only thing that I can possibly see might provide justification for direct military intervention. But
they could also use a proxy. Because they've been trying to instigate things in the Caribbean against Venezuela. So and also Colombia, if there's a way to use Colombia against Venezuela, that very well could be a mechanism for it.
But do you think Colombia seems to be slightly changing tack, or am I imagining that?
Towards Venezuela or away?
Towards Venezuela. Or away from the US to some degree. I've just seen some statements coming out from them.
Yeah, well, with the current president, he's sort of been kind of, I would say, like a left-leaning, not kind of liberal. He is overall a liberal, but he came in trying to unite all of the factions in Colombia. And so he sort of tried to play both sides, try to, play into some of the liberal agenda, but also simultaneously try to have at least a relationship with Venezuela, which hadn't happened with the last neoliberal administration that was heavily backed by the United States. And so it's hard to say, because they don't seem to fully embrace Venezuela like, say, Nicaragua or Cuba or these other countries have embraced Venezuela and fully in Latin America. They're more his government is more of a progressive type of government that I think walks a fine line when it comes to their relationship with the United States. Colombia is the only other country that has a sort of NATO-like partnership in Latin America. They have the bases. They were previously super tied to the United States, but now that's changed to a degree. It would depend on if there can be enough. If anybody was going to be infiltrated or convinced, it wouldn't be Venezuela. I think it would be Colombia, because they, like I said, they have a lot of like the liberal influence as well. And that's been tried in Venezuela also. I mean, I agree with you. It's hard to say, but I just don't see a full-on G.I. Joe, let's deploy all our military and fight in front of everybody with Venezuela. I just don't see them doing that either. And China and Russia, a lot of people say, oh, they're going to defend Venezuela. There's zero evidence to show that. Actually, there's more evidence to show that they wouldn't, because I thought they didn't interfere in people's affairs. So we the last thing I want to say on this is we get all the time, oh, they don't interfere in people's affairs, and then China, Russia, and are going to come.
They'll come to the rescue in Venezuela.
Venezuela. It's like, so which is it? Do they interfere in people's affairs or do they not? Like, what are you talking about here? So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, China did interfere in Yemen's affairs. It looted its oil from 2015. It supplied drones to Saudi Arabia to kill Yemenis. It did take a side, and people will hold up the fact that it brokered a peace deal between, basically Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Yemen and Saudi Arabia, but that didn't really work out all that well.
No,
I mean, the war is still ongoing. The blockade is still ongoing. Saudi Arabia, UAE are still targeting Yemen on behalf of Israel. Israel is directly targeting Yemen on a regular basis now. And Yemen is the only one upholding the Genocide Convention. So, I think that very clearly shows to me on which side China is. And it's not on the side of moral fortitude. It's on the side of economic trade and expansion. And this is that's the bottom line. That's the reality. And I think if you deny that reality, you're preventing, to a degree within your own sphere, an evolution of thinking and an evolution of understanding of what we want the world to be.
Well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up, Vanessa.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for listening again, guys. And I'm sorry if we keep talking about this, but it's a very important issue for me because if it were to change, and not even change dramatically, just change in the sense of upholding the international law that they claim to be central to their policies, then a lot could be done very quickly to actually stop what's happening in Palestine, in my opinion. And so that's why it's important, not because we want to kind of,
throw shade. Throw rocks. And then from Palestine, the rest of the world, right? I mean, if we don't react to that, then everything else we react to it is put up in question. So that's why if you want to change the world, start somewhere, I guess. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Critical Perspectives.